Why would a Navy SEAL unit ever show up at the door of a small-town mechanic? The question hung like a shadow over the quiet valley of Iron Springs, Tennessee. The answer, though, didn't begin with soldiers or ceremonies. It began with rust. Melissa Gray never thought of herself as a rescuer. At 32, she was just trying to keep her father's old garage alive, one oil change at a time. The shop floor carried 20 years of stains that told their own stories: stubborn engines, midnight repairs, and bills that didn't always get paid. Grease lived permanently under her nails. Calluses marked her palms like battle scars. And though her father had been gone for 5 years, his ghost still lingered in the echo of every wrench drop, in the smell of diesel that clung to the walls. She didn't expect a miracle that morning. She expected another fight with another tired vehicle, another day of patching rust with prayers. But then the bell above the door chimed, and Bert shuffled in. Bert was a Marine long ago, but the Corps had never really let go of him. At 55, his back moved stiff, his joints creaked like old hinges, but his eyes still carried the sharpness of a man who'd once lived with his life on the line. He had been her father's best friend, and when he sat down at her workbench stool with that folded newspaper clipping in his pocket, Melissa could feel the weight of something about to change. "Coffee's brewing," she muttered, not looking up from the Chevy she'd been fighting since Tuesday. "Good," Bert replied, "because I've got news that'll wake you better than caffeine." She sighed, wiping her hands on a rag that had lived 3 lives already. "Every time you say that, it means trouble. This time it means opportunity." He pulled the clipping free and smoothed it on the bench. "Salvage auction over in military surplus vehicles, and there's a '70 Army Jeep sitting there." Melissa's eyes flicked up, suspicious. She knew the tone in his voice, like he'd already decided what her answer should be. "What's the catch?" "It's rough. Been sitting behind a barn 20 years. Rust, mice, God knows what else. But the bones are good, you can feel it, and they're only asking 500. 500. She could almost hear her father's voice laughing at the word only. She had invoices stacked like tombstones in the office. 500 wasn't only. It was survival money, rent money, groceries for the week money. She wanted to shake her head. She wanted to tell him she didn't have time for side projects, that the smart choice was to walk away. But Bert leaned closer, lowering his voice the way he always did when he was about to say something that mattered. "Your daddy always said the best mechanics don't just fix what's broken. They bring back what everyone else gave up on." The words landed like a punch to the chest. She hated how easily they cracked through her armor. She hadn't felt fire in months, just routine, just survival. Maybe this was fire. "Where is it?" she asked before she could stop herself. That afternoon she found herself driving north, her beat-up Ford rattling along winding Tennessee roads where autumn painted the hills gold and crimson. She didn't tell herself why she was going. Maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper. Carson's salvage sat in a valley between ridges, acres of rusted dreams leaning into each other. The Jeep hid behind a barn, covered in a tarp so thin it was more memory than protection. When she pulled it away, her breath caught. It was worse than she'd expected. Rust had eaten through the doors. The windshield sagged like an old man. Weeds grew where seats should have been. A family of mice had claimed it as their inheritance. The tires weren't tires anymore. They were skeletons. But she saw it, the bones. She always saw bones. Beneath decay was something solid, something waiting. She could feel it the way only mechanics do, the unspoken language of steel. "She's been sitting here since my husband passed," came a voice. Melissa turned. An older woman stood there, silver hair pulled back neat, eyes carrying the sadness of rusting dreams. "I'm Norma Shaw," she said softly, "Cliff's widow. You must be the mechanic Bert told me about." Melissa introduced herself, still circling the Jeep like a surgeon preparing for a hopeless patient. Cliff bought that in '75, Norma said, her gaze locked on the wreck. Spent 2 years getting it running again. Said it reminded him of the vehicles he worked on in Vietnam. He was motor pool, kept the convoys moving, the ambulances alive. Loved this Jeep like a child. Melissa felt the air shift. This wasn't just a carcass of metal, this was history. What happened to the restoration plans? She asked gently. Life, Norma whispered. Kids, grandkids, the barn filled up with everything else. Cliff always said he'd finish it when he had more time. Then cancer came. Time ran out. Melissa swallowed hard. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything the man had left behind. 500, Norma said finally. That's what I'm asking. Not because it's worth that little, because Cliff would want it to go to someone who'd finish what he started. Melissa checked her bank account on her phone. Numbers small, but not small enough to stop her. This wasn't smart, but it felt right. She extended her hand. You've got yourself a deal. 2 days later, a flatbed rumbled down Main Street carrying what looked like a corpse. By the time it reached Gray's Auto Repair, half the town had gathered to watch. Small towns always gathered for madness. Lord have mercy, Mrs. Lane muttered from across the street. That girl's lost her mind. Deputy Page, leaning on her cruiser with coffee in hand, smirked. Looks like a crime scene. Want me to call forensics? Melissa ignored them, signing the paperwork. The Jeep lowered into her garage with a sound somewhere between a groan and a sigh, as if even it doubted her. Her kid brother circled it like it might bite. This thing looks like it died twice. What's the plan? The plan, she said, pulling on her gloves, is to bring it back to life. The crowd drifted off, leaving her alone with her gamble. She grabbed a shop light and began her first real inspection. The deeper she looked, the stranger it became. The wiring upgraded at some point, neat and professional. The radiator rebuilt though corroded. Tool marks on bolts, recent, deliberate. Someone had been preparing for this. Someone who ran out of time. In the glove compartment, damp but legible, she found the original registration. Clifford Shaw, 1975. Clipped to it was a handwritten note, Restoration, CS 1982. She sat on an overturned bucket as night fell around the garage. She could almost feel the man's presence, decades-old hope pressed into every bolt, every dream that never had a chance to breathe. All right, Cliff, she whispered, let's see what you were really planning. The train whistle echoed across the valley, lonely, carrying its own ghosts. She didn't know yet that this Jeep would change everything, that 3 weeks from now, men in Navy SEAL uniforms would march in formation to her garage door. For now it was just her, the Jeep, and a weight she couldn't quite name. How do you decide when something's worth saving? Melissa asked herself that question 3 mornings later, standing in the cold garage before dawn with a flashlight beam trembling across the Jeep's metal. Rust looked worse in honest light. What had seemed like surface scars were in fact deep wounds. The floor pans weren't just thin, they were gone in places, holes big enough to swallow a wrench. The fenders sagged under their own weight. Even the frame showed cancer eating it from the inside out. Bert whistled low, arriving with 2 truck stop coffees. Sweet mother of pearl, you sure know how to pick 'em. Melissa jabbed her pocket knife into the frame rail. The blade sank in like it was butter. She exhaled sharply. I'm not saying it can't be done, Bert muttered, setting the coffees down. I'm saying it's gonna cost more than $500 to make her roadworthy. You'd be smarter to strip her for parts, sell what you can and call it tuition. Melissa didn't answer. She felt stubborn heat rising in her chest. Maybe it was foolish pride. Maybe it was the way the morning sun broke through the garage windows, turning the Jeep's broken lines into something almost noble. Whatever it was, she refused to let go. Help me pull the seats, she said. Bert sighed but obeyed. Together they unbolted the front bench, revealing decades of forgotten junk. Loose change, a child's toy soldier, even a wrench rusted into place. But when they tackled the rear bench, something shifted. Melissa's fingers brushed against paper. Wedged deep inside there was a manila envelope sealed with old red wax, the edges water-stained. Across the front in block letters, important military service records. Beneath, in a different hand, for restoration project only. C. Shaw, 1983. Her heart kicked hard. Permission to open classified documents, she asked with a weak smile. Bert's eyebrows rose. Statute of limitations has to be up by now. She broke the seal. Inside were records, commendations, unit transfers, deployment notes, and photographs. She froze. The last photo showed 5 young men in fatigues, arms slung across each other's shoulders, grinning with the wild relief of soldiers who'd survived. Behind them sat a jeep, this jeep. Perfect, gleaming, with white stenciled numbers sharp on olive drab paint. Melissa's throat tightened. On the back, Cliff Shaw, Danny Martinez, Rick Palmer, Tom Bradley, Mike, Firebase Alpha, 1971, last day before rotating home. Bert leaned closer, his breath catching. That's not just any Jeep, that's his Jeep. Same dent on the bumper, same welds. He bought back his own vehicle. Melissa stared between photo and rusted metal. The dent was still there, buried under decades. The truth struck heavy. Cliff hadn't bought just any surplus machine. He had brought home the very Jeep that carried him through war. And now it sat in her garage, whispering secrets through rust. The discoveries didn't stop. Behind the dashboard, wrapped in oiled cloth, they found a small metal box. Inside, dog tags, 4 of them, Martinez, Palmer, Bradley, along with a folded letter in fading ink. Brothers, it read, if you're reading this, then someone found our time capsule. We hid these here on our last day at Alpha, promising whoever got the Jeep stateside would keep the memories safe. We swore we'd all meet up someday to finish what we started. Life had other plans, but maybe this old girl can bring us back together. Stay strong. Cliff Shaw, 1971. The silence in the garage thickened until Melissa could hear only her own heartbeat. She held the tags in her palm, heavy as history, as responsibility. Well, Bert said, voice rough, I guess we better do this right. News traveled fast. By the next morning, Pastor Clyde Reed walked in wearing work clothes instead of his clerical collar. He served as a chaplain in Desert Storm, and his hands bore the permanent grime of motor pools. Heard you might need help, he said. That drivetrain isn't standard. You'll order the wrong parts if you don't know what you're looking at. Sure enough, within hours, Melissa learned the Jeep would demand rare, expensive components. Transmission kits, suspension parts, floor pans. Each item added another weight to her already impossible ledger. She sat at the workbench, pen scratching a list of numbers she couldn't afford. Maybe it was time to scale back, just make it run, forget perfect restoration. Then Mrs. Lane marched in, retired schoolteacher. 4 decades of commanding classrooms had made her fearless. This isn't about making it run, she declared, pulling a check from her purse. The number on it made Melissa's eyes sting. I can't take this. You can, interrupted. On one condition, you document everything, pictures, notes, the story. Kids need to know what sacrifice looks like, what keeping promises means. Melissa swallowed, fighting the burn in her throat. The project had her. It belonged to something bigger now. Bigger came faster than expected. Deputy Page returned with a folder of records she dug up through the VA office. Danny Martinez, retired Air Force Master Sergeant, San. Rick Palmer, construction company owner, Colorado Springs. Mike dead in 1985, survived by a son in California. And Tom Bradley alive, active duty Navy, stationed at Commander, Navy SEAL. Melissa felt her pulse skip. A Navy SEAL, the same man from the photograph. Slid a printed email across the bench. Melissa read it silently. Deputy, thank you for reaching out regarding Sergeant Shaw's restoration project. The men mentioned were my unit brothers from Firebase Alpha. We made promises to each other that have never been fulfilled. I'm very interested in learning more about your discovery. Please provide contact information for the person overseeing the restoration. Respectfully, Commander T. Bradley, NSW. Melissa's hand shook slightly as she set the page down. A commander, special warfare, reaching out to her. This is bigger than us, isn't it? She whispered. Nobody disagreed. The garage became alive with urgency. Every part that arrived, every bolt that turned carried weight beyond mechanics. They weren't just building a Jeep. They were rebuilding a bridge to men who'd been scattered by time, by war, by silence. Each night Melissa lay awake, the letter and the dog tags replaying in her mind. She thought of Cliff, of promises buried in metal, of 40 years of unfinished dreams. She thought of his widow, watching the Jeep roll away from her yard, hoping someone would carry it forward. And she thought of the men still alive, waiting without even knowing they were waiting. The Jeep wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to them. But there was something Melissa hadn't told anyone. Not yet. Something she found in that envelope, something that burned at the edge of her thoughts, waiting for the right moment to surface. For now she kept working, because the Jeep had to live again. Why would an active-duty Navy SEAL commander care about a rusted Jeep in Tennessee? That question echoed in Melissa's mind as the weeks blurred into grease, sparks, and long nights in the garage. The Jeep was slowly transforming, engine freed, body stripped, steel patched, but the mystery only grew. Each part told a story. The bolts Cliff had turned, the welds he had laid, and the sketches Norma Shaw brought in one chilly evening, a cardboard box filled with blueprints her husband had drawn by hand. He hadn't been planning a simple rebuild. He had designed something more, a memorial Jeep, a vehicle meant not just to run but to carry memory, plaques, compartments for letters, even a period-correct radio to reach brothers scattered across the years. Melissa ran her fingers over the sketches, the ink faded but deliberate. Cliff had imagined the Jeep as a beacon, a way back to men who'd once leaned on him in jungles far from Tennessee. "We'll do it his way," she whispered, and she meant it. The community refused to let her carry it alone. By sunrise, Pastor Reed was cataloging every step with his old camera. Her kid brother scoured the internet for parts, calling suppliers in Kentucky, Ohio, Montana. Lane showed up daily, wielding a clipboard like a weapon, organizing volunteers with the same sternness she once used on classrooms. Reporters began to appear, notebooks in hand, cameras clicking. One local story turned into five. Five turned into a dozen calls from across the country. Veterans sent money. Collectors donated parts. And then, one night, the phone rang while Melissa was up to her elbows in transmission fluid. "Miss Gray," the voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who lived with command. "This is Commander Tom Bradley. I believe you're working on something that belonged to some old friends of mine." Melissa froze, wiped her hands on a rag that never got clean, tried to steady her voice. "Commander Bradley, yes, we've been hopping to reach you. I've been following through, Deputy. What you're doing means more than you realize. Those men you found in the photograph, we lost touch, but we never forgot what we promised each other. I'd like to discuss bringing the surviving members of our unit to Iron Springs. It's time we kept our word to Cliff." When the line went dead, Melissa stood in silence, rag clenched in her fist. Her $500 gamble had become something much bigger. Danny Martinez called next. His voice was gravel rough, worn by years of engines and deployments. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been thinking about that Jeep every night since told me. Cliff was the finest soldier I ever served with. If his widow trusted you with this, you've got my support. I'll be there." Melissa held the phone tight, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll have her ready." You know what we used to say at Firebase Alpha? He asked softly. We finish what we started. Took us 40 years, but I'll be damned if we let this chance pass. The weight of those words pressed deep into her chest. By the following week, parts began to flood in. Reproduction floor pans from Colorado, brake kits from Ohio, transmission components from a collector in Montana who refused payment once he heard the story. The garage looked less like a shop and more like a staging ground. Pieces of history laid out, waiting to be reborn. Bert stood over a set of shock absorbers one afternoon, his hands trembling slightly as he held them. "This is how it should be done," he said. "No shortcuts. These boys deserve authenticity." Melissa nodded, though her throat burned with pressure she didn't admit. Every bolt tightened felt like more than mechanics. It felt like responsibility she could never fully carry. Because there was still something she hadn't told them. Something in Cliff's envelope that unsettled her more than the rust ever had. The restoration accelerated. George Shaw, Cliff's nephew, arrived with duffels full of radios and manuals. He had served in Afghanistan, communications specialist. The Jeep became his therapy as much as hers. "Uncle Cliff always talked about finishing this Jeep," he told her one evening, threading antenna cables through steel. "Even when I was a kid, he believed it could bring people back together. I didn't get it then. I do now." Melissa watched him work, the hum of soldering irons filling the night. She wondered how many soldiers carried burdens their families never saw, how many secrets rusted in barns, waiting to be uncovered. And then came Bradley's second message. Arrived breathless, holding her phone. "He's not coming alone." Melissa frowned. "What do you mean?" 12 Navy personnel traveling with him, official vehicles, escorts. Melissa, they're bringing a SEAL platoon." The garage went silent. A platoon, in full formation, for her Jeep. "Why?" Melissa asked. The word felt too small for the weight of it. Shook her head. "He said it was appropriate, said there are things we don't understand yet, things he'll explain when he arrives." Melissa leaned against the workbench, her hands shaking. This had started as rust and stubbornness. Now the United States Navy was moving like shadows around her small-town garage. The Jeep sat gleaming under fluorescent light, half-painted, half-reborn. A time capsule, a promise, a secret. She whispered into the silence, almost afraid of the answer. "Cliff, what were you really part of? Why would a convoy of black SUVs roll into a sleepy Tennessee town just for a Jeep?" That was the question on everyone's lips as Friday evening fell over Iron Springs. Melissa stood outside her garage, hands trembling in her pockets, when the sound reached them first, the low synchronized hum of engines, then headlights cutting through dusk. 3 government SUVs, followed by a military transport van, gliding down Main Street with surgical precision. They parked in perfect formation, doors opened in unison, and then he stepped out. Commander Tom Bradley, dress blues immaculate, ribbons and insignia shining like fragments of history pinned to his chest. He carried himself like a man who'd lived in shadowed places, where a single mistake meant lives lost. Yet when his eyes found Martinez and Palmer waiting beside the restored Jeep, his face softened. "Brothers," he said simply, and in that word decades of distance collapsed. The 3 men, survivors of Firebase Alpha, embraced, grayer now, slower, but still bound by promises made when the world was younger and bloodier. But then the rest of the Navy personnel stepped forward, 12 men, a full SEAL platoon. Moving as one, they formed ranks around the Jeep. The sight silenced the crowd that had gathered along the sidewalks. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't theater. It was something heavier. Melissa felt her knees weaken. What in God's name had she stepped into? Later that evening, Bradley requested a private meeting. No cameras, no reporters, just a handful of them inside Pastor Reed's church sanctuary, the Jeep positioned beneath stained glass windows. The seals stood like statues along the walls, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. Melissa sat across from Bradley, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Beside her, Bert, Pastor Reed, and the surviving Firebase Alpha brothers. Bradley set a manila folder on the pew in front of him. Its cover bore official seals, red stamps, classified. "What I'm about to share," he began, his voice low but carrying, "was only 6 months ago. Sergeant Clifford Shaw wasn't just a motor pool mechanic. He was part of Project Phoenix." The words landed like a blade. Melissa glanced at Martinez and Palmer. Their faces tightened, recognition dawning. Bradley continued. "Phoenix was one of the most sensitive operations of the Vietnam conflict. Intelligence missions, deep cover work, sabotage. The kind of assignments no one talked about, even among their own units. Shaw volunteered for 17 such missions between 1970 and 1971. The sanctuary fell into a silence, so sharp Melissa could hear the tick of the church clock. Bradley opened the folder, laying out photographs. One showed Cliff in civilian clothing, hair longer, standing in a Vietnamese market beside the very jeep they had restored. "He infiltrated supply networks," Bradley explained. "Sabotaged transport routes, collected intelligence that prevented attacks on American bases. He operated for days at a time behind enemy lines." Melissa's breath caught. Cliff Shaw, the quiet mechanic, the man who sketched blueprints in his barn, had been walking into fire no one else even knew existed. But Bradley wasn't finished. His last mission went wrong. March 1971. He was captured, held for 6 days, tortured. They wanted details about Phoenix, about the networks, about his team. Bradley's voice faltered for the first time. He never broke, never compromised. The intelligence he protected saved American lives, but when he escaped, he came back changed. And he never told a soul. Melissa pressed her hand against her chest. She could almost see it, the young mechanic sitting alone, carrying secrets that bent his shoulders, sketching plans for a jeep that might hold the weight he couldn't share with anyone else. "Why wasn't he recognized?" Pastor Reed asked quietly. Bradley exhaled. "Politics. Phoenix was controversial. Acknowledging it would risk diplomatic fallout. So men like Shaw carried their scars in silence, waiting for the day classification lifted." He opened a velvet case. Inside gleamed metals that seemed almost too heavy for the world, the silver star, the purple heart, a prisoner of war medal. And then one more, a medal few civilians recognized. "The Navy Special Operations Distinguished Service Medal," Bradley said. His eyes softened as they found Melissa's. "Cliff's innovations in covert work are still used today. Techniques we train SEALs with. He is considered by us an honorary member of the special warfare community. Tomorrow, we will present these to his widow with full military honors." Melissa's throat burned. She had started this journey chasing rust. She was ending it sitting in a church pew with secrets spilling from classified files. When the meeting broke, Melissa lingered. The SEAL platoon carried the jeep back toward her garage, their formation unbroken, their silence profound. Bradley paused beside her. "Miss Gray, do you understand what you've done?" She swallowed. "I restored a jeep." He shook his head. "You restored a promise. You gave us a chance to close a circle 50 years wide. That's more than mechanics." As he walked away, Melissa felt the weight settle heavier than before. That night sleep refused her. She sat alone in the garage, staring at the jeep gleaming under fluorescent light. She thought of Cliff, of his silence, of secrets carved into his bones. She thought of Norma Shaw, carrying grief without knowing its full shape. And she thought of her own father. He had always said machines weren't just machines. They were stories. Some stories broke you. Some stories saved you. Melissa whispered to the empty air, to the ghosts she felt circling around her. "Tomorrow, Cliff. Tomorrow they'll finally hear what you carried." The jeep seemed to glow in reply. as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Why would a whole town fall silent for a single vehicle? The answer came on a crisp Saturday morning when Iron Springs gathered in front of Gray's Auto Repair, the air thick with anticipation. Flags lined Main Street. Folding chairs filled the sidewalks. Veterans wore their service caps, medals pinned proudly to faded jackets. Children clutched paper flags, sensing even if they didn't understand that something important was about to happen. The Jeep sat at the center of it all, no longer rust and ruin but reborn. Olive drab paint gleamed under the autumn sun, white stenciled numbers sharp on the hood. The windshield, polished and upright, reflected rows of faces. Tires new, suspension strong, engine ticking like a steady heart. Melissa stood beside it, her coveralls cleaner than usual, though grease still traced her fingernails. She felt every eye on her but forced herself to focus on the Jeep, on the bolts she had turned, the nights she had fought through exhaustion. Her hands shook despite herself. And then the sound rose again, the low synchronized hum of engines. 3 black SUVs and a military transport, the same convoy, the same precision. The SEAL platoon stepped out first, moving in perfect unison, their presence commanding the space without a word. Then came Commander Bradley. Behind him, Danny Martinez and Rick Palmer. And finally, Norma Shaw, dressed in black, her silver hair pinned neatly, eyes carrying a quiet storm. When the SEALs took position around the Jeep, the crowd went utterly still. No coughs, no murmurs, only silence as if the entire town held its breath. Bradley stepped forward, his voice carried without need for a microphone. Citizens of Iron Springs, today we honor a man who carried secrets heavier than steel, a man who protected lives at the cost of silence, a man whose story was buried but whose integrity never faded. He motioned, and 2 SEALs opened a case. Inside lay the medals Melissa had seen in the church sanctuary. The United States recognizes Sergeant Clifford Shaw for extraordinary heroism during covert operations under Project Phoenix, Vietnam, 1970-71, for valor under captivity, for sacrifice without recognition, and for innovation that still saves lives today. Norma stepped forward, her hands trembling. Bradley placed each medal in her palms, the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, the POW medal, the Distinguished Service Medal. Her tears glistened in sunlight, falling onto the ribbons as though baptizing them anew. The crowd remained silent, reverent. Even children seemed to understand that noise had no place here. And then Bradley turned. But Sergeant Shaw left behind more than medals. He left behind a promise. He gestured to the Jeep. The platoon moved as one, circling it, saluting in unison. The sight carried such gravity Melissa's chest tightened until she couldn't breathe. This vehicle, Bradley continued, carried Cliff and his brothers through fire. It carried their hopes, their vows, and now, thanks to the work of this community, and especially the hands of Melissa Gray, it carries their memory back to life. He paused, letting silence say what words could not. Sometimes honor takes decades to arrive, but when it does, it shines brighter for the wait. Norma reached for the Jeep, her fingers brushing its hood. Cliff would have loved this, she whispered, though the microphone carried it to the crowd. He never spoke of what he went through. He only spoke of what he wanted to finish. Thank you for finishing it for him. Melissa stepped closer, uncertain if she belonged in the spotlight, but Norma caught her hand and pulled her forward. This young woman, Norma said, her voice cracking, gave Cliff his voice back. Not with speeches, with wrenches, with nights in silence, with belief. Melissa felt heat rush to her cheeks. She wanted to shrink away, to fade into the background, but Bradley's steady gaze anchored her. You honored him the way he lived, he said softly, quietly, with work, with dignity. Then came the moment that stunned the town into deeper silence. Bradley raised his hand. The SEAL platoon shifted. One man stepped forward, carrying a folded American flag. Another carried a small wooden box, the kind used for time capsules. This, Bradley announced, was found inside the Jeep. Letters, dog tags, memories left by the men of Firebase Alpha in 1971. They hid them, hoping someday they'd be seen again. Today we seal them into this box, and this Jeep, this memorial, will carry them forever. Melissa's chest tightened as the dog tags she had first held in secret now gleamed in the open air. Martinez and Palmer touched them with reverence, whispering names under their breath. "Mike," Palmer murmured, eyes wet. "God, brother, I wish you were here." The names hung in the air like prayers. The box was sealed, placed carefully into a hidden compartment beneath the rear seat, the very place Melissa had first discovered Cliff's envelope. The seal who slid it in saluted sharply. The Jeep wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a living memorial. After the formalities, after the flags and salutes, the crowd remained. They wanted to touch the Jeep, to run fingers along steel that now carried more than paint. Veterans lingered longest, eyes distant, as if the Jeep stirred memories of their own long-buried battles. Melissa slipped away to the edge of the crowd. Her chest still shook with the weight of it all. She thought of her father, how he would have stood proud, arms crossed, nodding in approval. She thought of Cliff, of the quiet he must have carried, and how heavy silence can become when no one listens. She felt a hand on her shoulder. Turning, she found Bradley. "You did more than restore a Jeep," he said. "You reminded us what promises mean." She searched his eyes. Why bring a platoon? Why so much ceremony? Bradley held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Because Cliff's work shaped us more than history will ever say. Because this Jeep isn't just his, it's all of ours. And because sometimes silence deserves to be broken with thunder." His words lingered as he walked away. That night when the crowd had gone and only the Jeep remained under the dim garage lights, Melissa sat alone on the workbench. She stared at the metals Norma had allowed her to hold one last time. The metal felt heavier than steel, heavier than any wrench. She whispered into the stillness, "Cliff, it's finished. They know now." But part of her wondered if it truly was finished. Because in that sealed box, in those files, in Bradley's guarded tone, there were pieces of the story still missing. And deep down, Melissa feared she had only uncovered the beginning. Why couldn't she sleep, even after the medals, the salutes, the applause? The whole town had gone quiet again, settling back into ordinary rhythms after the extraordinary spectacle. But Melissa couldn't. Not with the Jeep sitting under dim lights, humming with a weight that felt unfinished. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was something sharper, a nagging, unspoken truth clawing at the back of her mind. She went back to the garage at midnight. Alone, no fanfare, just her, the Jeep, and the silence. She opened the driver's door, sat behind the wheel, and let her hands rest on the steering column. The Jeep smelled of paint, leather, and oil. New yet old, reborn yet haunted. Her eyes kept drifting to the rear seat, the compartment where they had sealed the box of letters and tags. It should have brought closure, but instead it felt like a warning. Because in Cliff's original envelope, the one she had never fully explained, there had been one more paper. She hadn't shown Bradley. She hadn't told Norma. She hadn't even told Bert. It was a simple map, drawn in pencil faded with age. A map of a valley, a river bend, and a symbol scrawled in the margin, a star. Next to it, Cliff's handwriting, shaky but deliberate, Firebase Alpha, personal cache, for whoever finishes the Jeep. Melissa unfolded it now, her hands trembling. What had Cliff left behind in that jungle 50 years ago, and why tie it to this Jeep? The next morning, the garage smelled of coffee and fresh biscuits when Bert walked in. He found Melissa hunched over the map, circles of exhaustion under her eyes. "What in blazes is that?" he asked. She hesitated, then slid it across. His eyes narrowed as he traced the lines. "That's not just some doodle, that's a field sketch." He marked a cache. "A cache of what?" Bert leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Could be anything. Ammo, documents, photos, maybe even things he didn't want anyone else to find. Melissa shook her head. Why keep it secret all these years? Why tie it to the Jeep? Maybe he didn't trust anyone but the one who'd care enough to restore it, Bert said quietly. And now that's you. The weight of his words pressed hard. She wasn't sure she wanted to carry it. 2 days later, Bradley returned alone. No convoy, no SEAL formation, just him in civilian clothes, his face drawn with fatigue. Melissa hesitated before showing him the map, but something in his eyes told her he already knew. He studied it for a long moment, jaw tightening, so he left it behind. "You knew?" she asked, voice sharp. "I suspected," Bradley admitted. "Some of us heard whispers. Cliff hinted he buried things during Phoenix Ops, things he couldn't carry out, but I didn't know he documented it." "What kind of things?" Bradley looked at her with a weight that made her stomach twist. "Evidence. Records of missions the government buried, names, dates, what we did in the shadows. If it's there, it could change the way history remembers Vietnam. Or it could bury reputations. Depends on what you find." Melissa stared at the map, her pulse hammering. "And if someone else finds it?" Bradley's voice lowered. "That's why we guard it. Secrets don't stay buried forever. Cliff knew that. Maybe that's why he wanted someone like you to bring the Jeep back, because you wouldn't just leave the truth to rot." Word spread slowly through the veterans who had gathered in town. Martinez came by, his face lined with both hope and dread. "Firebase Alpha," he muttered when she showed him the map. "God help us, that place was hell. We left more than footprints there. Cliff must known." Palmer added his voice later, his construction-rough hands trembling as he held the paper. "If he buried something, it's not just history, it's unfinished business." Melissa felt like the air was closing in. She was a mechanic, not a soldier, not an operative. Yet here she stood, holding a key to secrets men twice her age still feared. That evening, Norma Shaw appeared at the garage, clutching a small wooden box. She opened it carefully, revealing a pocket knife with Cliff's initials carved into the handle. "He carried this every day," she said softly. "When he came home, he stopped using it, just set it in a drawer, like it had seen too much." Melissa turned it over in her hand, the blade nicked, worn, yet sharp. She wondered if Cliff had used it to carve the very map now lying on her workbench. Norma's eyes filled with tears. "If Cliff wanted you to find what he left, then you have to. Don't let fear stop you. He believed in you, even if he never met you." But fear did stop her, at least for a while. That night, Melissa paced the garage floor, torn between duty and dread. If she ignored the map, the Jeep would still stand as a memorial. No one would know. The story could end here, neat and honorable. But if she pursued it, she might uncover truths people didn't want uncovered. Truths that could scar reputations, hurt families, unravel legends. She pressed her forehead against the Jeep's hood, whispering, "Cliff, what did you leave me?" The steel was cool beneath her skin, silent, offering no answers. By the next morning, her choice was made for her. Two strangers appeared in town, not locals, not veterans, clean suits, dark glasses, government-issue silence. They asked questions about the Jeep, about the restoration, about whether anything unusual had been found. Deputy spotted them near the courthouse and came straight to Melissa. "Something up," she warned. "They're not here for tourism. Be careful what you show." Melissa's chest tightened. The map in her pocket felt heavier than stone. Cliff's secret was no longer safe. Someone else was looking. She locked the garage that night, sat in the dark beside the Jeep, and clutched the pocket knife. The mission wasn't over. It had only just begun. Why would two strangers in suits care about a rusty Jeep from 1970? That was the question twisting in Melissa's gut as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spin shadows across her room. The men hadn't introduced themselves, hadn't offered credentials, just asked clipped, careful questions, and every word carried the same message: "Don't dig deeper." But she already had. By morning, the whole town hummed with unease. Veterans at Clyde Reed's diner whispered about government men sniffing around, kept circling her patrol car past the garage, more protective than she'd admit. Even, usually carefree, kept glancing over his shoulder. Melissa pretended to work, tightening bolts, polishing fenders, but her mind stayed on the folded map in her pocket. It was like a live coal burning against her. Every choice radiated consequences. She wanted to hand it over, wash her hands of the whole thing, let history keep its secrets, but every time she tried, she saw Cliff's sketch lines, his shaky handwriting, the star-marked cache. A mechanic doesn't leave tools in the dirt, and Cliff hadn't left that map for nothing. Bradley returned that afternoon. No convoy, no uniform, just a plain jacket and tired eyes. He closed the garage door behind him, sealing them in. "They approached me too," he said quietly. "Asked if I'd seen anything unusual. I didn't tell them about the map." Melissa exhaled in relief, then bristled. "So you knew they'd come?" He nodded. There are always men who prefer silence. If Cliff documented something Phoenix-related, it's dynamite. Could rewrite reports, expose missions. Some of those men are in positions of power even now. They won't want the past unearthed. Melissa crossed her arms, pulse rising. "And what do you want? For me to keep it buried?" Bradley studied her. "I want the truth, but I also want you safe. You've already given more than anyone expected. It shouldn't fall on your shoulders." Her voice cracked sharper than she meant, but it has. The Jeep loomed behind them, its steel lines gleaming like judgment. That night she sat alone on the workbench, the map spread out under the dim light. Her hands hovered above it, afraid to touch, as though contact might set it aflame. What had Cliff buried? Proof of atrocities, names of those betrayed, or something simpler, letters, photographs, fragments of himself he couldn't carry home. The uncertainty gnawed. She thought of Norma, clutching the medals with tears. Would those tears sour if she learned what Cliff had hidden? Would the story collapse under truth? Melissa pressed her hands to her face. She didn't want to be the keeper of history. She wanted to fix machines, not bear the weight of men's silence. But then she remembered her father's words, years ago, when she had been a child too scared to climb onto a roof where he worked. Sometimes courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's the hand that doesn't let go, even when no one's watching. Her hands lowered, her decision formed. She wouldn't let go. The next morning she told Bert. His reaction was a low whistle. "So, we're talking about digging up something left in Vietnam 50 years ago, and you think you're the one meant to find it?" Melissa bristled. "Not think, no. He left it for whoever finished the Jeep." Bert shook his head. "Girl, you're playing with fire, but I've followed you this far. I won't stop now." When she told, the deputy's jaw tightened. "Then we do this right. We don't sneak around. We get eyes on us. Cameras, witnesses. If the truth makes enemies, at least it won't vanish quietly." Melissa felt the weight ease just a little. She wasn't alone. Still, the pressure grew. That afternoon, the suited men returned. This time, they stepped into the garage uninvited. One leaned close, voice low, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "Miss Gray, you've done something remarkable here, restored a piece of history, but history is fragile. Sometimes what's hidden is better left buried, for everyone's sake." Melissa's throat tightened. She said nothing, only gripped the rag in her hands until her knuckles whitened. The second man smiled faintly. "We'd hate to see your work compromised." Then they left, their footsteps crisp, their meaning sharper than any words. Melissa stood frozen long after the door shut. Threat or warning, it didn't matter. She understood the message. And yet, instead of fear, something else filled her. Defiance. Cliff had carried secrets through torture, through silence, through years of obscurity. He hadn't broken. How could she? That night, Bradley came again. He laid his hands flat on the Jeep's hood, his voice softer than Melissa had ever heard. "Cliff taught me something," he said. That dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it endures. You're carrying that same dignity now, whether you know it or not. Melissa met his gaze. Then help me. Don't just protect me. Help me finish what he started. Bradley's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. All right, we'll go after the cash, carefully, quietly, not alone. The jeep seemed to hum between them, as if steel itself approved. Plans formed. Not reckless ones, but deliberate. Bradley would call in favors, quiet veterans, trusted allies, men who knew the terrain. Melissa would keep the jeep ready, not just as a symbol, but as a vessel to carry the story once it was found. But even as they prepared, Melissa couldn't shake the fear curling in her chest. Fear not of danger, but of truth. What if Cliff's cache revealed something that shattered everything they'd built? What if the medals, the honor, the ceremony, all of it, was undone by one box of paper in a foreign jungle? The question gnawed, sleepless and sharp. Still, her choice was made. She stood alone in the garage one last time before dawn, tracing her hand along the jeep's hood. She whispered to the silence, as if Cliff himself might hear her across time. You trusted me with this. I won't run. I won't bury it again. The words hung in the air, and for the first time since she'd started, Melissa didn't feel like the jeep was a machine. She felt like it was a compass, pointing her somewhere she hadn't yet seen. Somewhere dangerous, somewhere necessary. And she knew, deep down, the journey wasn't finished. It was only about to begin. Why would a rusted jeep in Tennessee point all the way back to a jungle half a world away? That was the question on Melissa's lips as the wheels of a transport plane touched down on Vietnamese soil. She hadn't come alone. Bradley was there, his presence a shield against both danger and doubt. Martinez and Palmer came too, insisting this wasn't just her mission, it was theirs. Even Deputy, stubborn as ever, managed to secure leave, refusing to let Melissa step into the unknown without someone from Iron Springs at her side. The air hit like a wall, thick, damp, alive with the buzz of cicadas. Jungle stretched beyond the tarmac, green and endless. For the older men, it was a return to ghosts. For Melissa, it was stepping into one. She carried the map folded against her chest, Cliff's handwriting still smudged from her trembling fingers. Firebase Alpha, a river bend, a star, a cache waiting 50 years for someone stubborn enough to follow. They traveled deep into the countryside. Old trucks, dirt roads, guides who knew the terrain better than any GPS. Martinez rode in silence, his eyes locked on the tree lines as if every shadow still hid an enemy. Palmer muttered prayers under his breath. Melissa felt the weight of their history pressing in. Every rustle of leaves, every scent of damp earth, carried echoes of men who hadn't come home. She wondered how Cliff had walked these same paths, carrying secrets too heavy to share. By late afternoon they reached it, the valley marked on the map. A river bent wide, curling around a ridge where jungle swallowed stone. The guides pointed. Old American ground, firebase long gone, jungle took it back. Melissa's pulse hammered. She unfolded the map again, compared ink to earth. It matched. They began to dig. It wasn't easy. The soil clung, roots tangled, insects swarmed. But the veterans moved with grim determination, each strike of a shovel less about earth and more about memory. Bradley's face was hard as granite, but sweat streaked his temples. Melissa worked until her hands blistered, her muscles screaming. She wanted to stop. She wanted to run. But every time she faltered, she thought of Cliff's sketch lines, of the jeep, of silence carried too long. Then her shovel struck something solid. She froze. Bradley dropped to his knees, brushing away soil. A rusted metal box emerged, edges eaten by time but still intact. Melissa's breath caught. Cliff's cache. They hauled it out, setting it on the earth. For a long moment, no one moved. The jungle buzzed louder, as though the world itself leaned in. Open it, Bradley said quietly. Melissa's hands shook as she pulled the latch. The lid groaned, reluctant after half a century, and then it gave. Inside lay bundles wrapped in oilskin, faded papers, dog tags, a leather-bound notebook, photographs blackened by age but still legible, faces of men, places unnamed, evidence of missions never recorded. Bradley lifted one document, his eyes narrowing. Operational logs, Phoenix, targets hit, names, dates, things the world never knew. Martinez pulled a photograph free, his voice breaking. Mike, God, he was smiling that day. But it was the notebook that stopped Melissa cold. Cliff's handwriting, page after page, his words unfiltered, unburied. She read the first lines aloud, her voice trembling. If you're reading this, you've finished what I could not. This Jeep, this cash, it was never about me. It was about us. About the men who bled in shadows and were forgotten in daylight. History may not want us, but memory still does. Carry this, whoever you are. Carry it so silence doesn't win. Melissa pressed the notebook to her chest, tears burning. For the first time, she felt she was hearing Cliff's voice. Not through steel, not through sketches, but through words meant for someone who cared enough to listen. They packed the cash carefully, securing every paper, every photograph. As they prepared to leave, Bradley touched Melissa's shoulder. You realize what this means. Once this surfaces, stories change. Reputations crack. Some will hate you for it. Melissa met his gaze. Then let them. Cliff didn't stay silent through torture just for us to stay silent now. Bradley's expression softened. You sound like him. The return home carried a strange mix of triumph and sorrow. The veterans spoke little, each lost in thought. When they reached Iron Springs, the Jeep waited in the garage like a sentinel. Melissa laid the notebook on its hood. She whispered, "It's back with you now." Word spread fast. Reporters returned, cameras flashing, eager for details. Government men reappeared, their questions sharper, their warnings colder. But this time Melissa wasn't alone. Bradley stood beside her, Martinez, Palmer, and half the town. The Jeep wasn't just steel, it was shield, witness, proof. And Cliff's story, written in grease in silence in a jungle cache, was finally heard. Weeks later, a ceremony was held at the courthouse, not as grand as the first but heavier with truth. Veterans lined the steps, families clutched photographs. Bradley spoke, his voice steady. Today we acknowledge not just the medals but the silence, not just the Jeep but the burden. Men like Clifford Shaw gave more than orders asked and carried more than history recorded. Today, silence ends. Melissa stood back, letting Norma Shaw hold the notebook. Tears traced the widow's cheeks as her fingers brushed Cliff's words. 50 years, she whispered, and he still found a way to speak. Melissa swallowed hard. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt tired, worn, but proud. Because sometimes pride doesn't roar. Sometimes it just breathes. That night when the town had gone quiet again, Melissa sat alone in the garage. The Jeep gleamed softly under the lights. She ran her hand along the hood, whispering, "We did it, Cliff. They heard you." And for a moment she thought she felt it, the faintest hum beneath her palm. Not metal, not machine, memory. She leaned back, closing her eyes. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.